Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the terrific work being done by folks who have used the historical collections held in the Hagley Library, especially scholars who have received support from the Hagley Center in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds. One such scholar joins me today. Rebecca Falkoff is assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Rebecca, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and
Oh,
and thank you for inviting me to come to the Hagley Museum and Library. It was wonderful.
oh, you're very welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is
Sure.
it you're researching and writing about?
So I'm working on a manuscript tentatively titled Industrious Skies, which is about the history of nitrogen capture primarily in fascist Italy. So this is a history that is often, many consider this rightly to be kind of the most significant technological development of the 20th century. So this is not a small topic. The place where this history is kind of most pivotal is Germany, because that's where the Haber-Bosch process was developed. It changed kind of the situation with World War One. But after the war, industrialized nations all kind of struggled to develop their own methods to fix atmospheric nitrogen. And even well before the war, the nitrogen problem had emerged as this kind of crux of scarcity. And so, what I'm interested in is what it means in fascist Italy to be speaking about scarcity in these terms, and perhaps even more significantly, what it means to be thinking about scarcity as something that is no longer a problem. And what this kind of incredible sense of abundance in theory meant, and how that translated into kind of everyday life. Um, so a lot of what I'm looking at is um, texts like essays by a prominent modernist writer, someone who became a prominent modernist writer who really uh, sings the praises of this technology in a kind of beautiful language. And then the futurists, of course, were really excited by industrial chemistry. So there's some uh, recipes that touch on nitrogen capture. There's a lot of thinking about what this means in terms of grain independence in Italy. So,
Mhm. Well, why does nitrogen matter so much?
well, nitrogen is it's essential to all life. It forms proteins, but in terms of kind of human history, the types of compounds, well, obviously life is important to human history as well, but the compounds that are most significant in this moment are those that have to do with fertilizers and explosives. So this is a time when guano from Peru has been depleted, and the sort of guanomania of the mid 19th century um, gave way to, let's say, saltpeter mania. And at the turn of the century, and on the eve of the First World War, um, saltpeter from Chile was being used in, I think, three-quarters of the world's fertilizer supply. Um, After the war, there were concerns about the either that being limited or it just being expensive. And nations wanted to have a means to be able to survive if they were cut off from saltpeter, as Germany was during World War One, or it was a moment when nations were struggling to achieve autarky, and really thinking a lot about how they could be free from dependence on other nations. And that was critical for, globally, I think, but in fascist Italy, it was central. And it became kind of official policy after 1935 when there were sanctions imposed on Italy. But long before that, it was really part of the ideology of fascist Italy.
Mhm. Well, it seems to have a really interesting twin aspect, the fertilizing and the explosives and
Yeah.
armaments, the sort of life and death on each face of the coin. That seems like a rich topic for you to be working on.
Yeah, it is. And it's kind of, I mean, one of the things, one of the sort of fascist initiatives that I think is really shaped by this is the natalism campaign, the pronatalism movement. So this idea that people should be having more children. And then that will provide limitless workers, limitless soldiers. So there's this kind of exuberance of life and death that are both connected to nitrogen capture. Um,
Hmm.
and that, you know, we see emerging, I mean, I think this is a historical moment that is really interesting, obviously, because of the way it anticipates a lot of contemporary politics and kind of techno-fascism that is emerging now. And
Hmm.
techno-futurism, like a lot of the things that were starting in Italy in the early 20th century are really uh, similar to things we see today. So.
Well, could you perhaps put our feet on the ground in fascist Italy, so to speak, and explain what the world looked like from that perspective and how nitrogen fit into that?
Sure. I mean, one of the interesting things about fascist Italy is that there was this sort of constant emphasis on the mistreatment of Italy by other nations. Italy was wronged by the Treaty of Versailles. They went in and fought for the Allied nations and then didn't get the territory they wanted in Dalmatia. And so there's this, like, it's very important in fascist rhetoric that the world is abusing Italians and that Italy is a nation scarce in raw materials. There's not a lot in terms of fossil fuels. And there's also a lot of ongoing resentment that Italy didn't get its so-called place in the sun and that other European nations had significant, I mean, and this becomes an important myth that endures today that Italian colonialism was not significant. It was quite significant, but there is a sense that it's been wronged and it didn't get what it deserved in the war and what it deserved as a European nation, and that it has scarce raw materials, and that and I'm parroting fascist discourse, so if I but that while England was sort of hoarding land and raw materials, but not doing anything with it, in Italy, there's this incredible inventive genius. And, a lot of that gets a lot of sort of harking back to uh, ancient Rome and to the Renaissance and to sort of great moments in Italian history gets brought into this idea that Italy is rich in inventive genius and poor in raw materials, and its workers who have fled Italy to seek better lives in America are being treated badly, exploited, and that so there's just this sort of really powerful sense of having been wronged, a resentment, and that's coupled with a kind of bombastic sense that they are more creative and inventive than other nations. And that aligns really nicely with what the technology of nitrogen capture does. And, again, nitrogen capture is something that's happening around the world, but the way in which it gets talked about in Italy, the narratives that are being produced about it, are really simpatico with fascist ideology.
Yeah, I can see how those things fit together so neatly because the atmospheric nitrogen capture is both a product of high technology, and so it speaks
Mhm.
to that sense of the fascist potency of technology and the inherent genius of the Italian nation, or what have you here,
Yeah,
combined with offsetting resource scarcity by
yeah.
allowing Italy to potentially to feed itself, which it hadn't been able to do for some time. Am I following your line of reasoning here?
No, that's exactly it. Yeah. I mean, yes, that's exactly it.
Hmm.
Yes, so that's a really, I mean, yeah, it's kind of striking how well it works with fascist ideology. And again, the technology is everywhere, but this particular mobilization of it takes shape in Italy in this way. And to some extent, the emphasis on population, the emphasis on grain independence, there's also this big kind of draining of the swamps, bonifica or land reclamation that's going on as well. So there are other ways in which grain independence is being sought, but synthetic fertilizers were a big part of that. But regardless of kind of the material outcomes, there's this idea that that becomes really powerful, even as, there was some population increase, but it wasn't as significant as what one might expect given what nitrogen does. It's also in this kind of disconnect between the kind of fantasy that nitrogen capture is allowing and the slow and unsteady implementation. There's also a lot of conflicting advice that's being given to farmers about, is it better to mix synthetic fertilizers from like superphosphates and ammonia, or is it, which are most effective? How do you mix them? What do you do? Um, all those things are changing really quickly, even as this kind of unchanging narrative about genius is hovering.
Hmm.
So another thing that I'm working with in this book is navigating between the literal and the figurative, and the idea of air. And again, this is big, perhaps too big, because if we say ideology is what is in the air, or if we think about sort of fascism as being in the air we breathe, you can say that about any ideology anywhere that somehow, and that's a kind of Althusserian understanding of ideology, that it is like inescapable, that there's no outside of ideology. And so it's a way of thinking about a broader notion of consent simply by being there and participating, and which is too big, but it's something I'm going to kind of constantly play off of. Um, so yeah, does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, that's really fascinating. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have to be careful because it also allows for, once you start saying something is in the air, you're allowing, I mean, I put myself in a position with a kind of unlimited critical power because it's also what I say is in the air. I mean, obviously, well, Marx has this interesting analogy with commodity fetishism where he says, even once we know the component elements of air, we continue to breathe. So it doesn't matter, and that's the idea of like we know very well, and yet we continue to behave in certain ways. Um,
Mm.
to some extent, I think that is the case. At the same time, he probably wouldn't have written that about the soil. He wouldn't have said, once we know the constituent elements of the soil, we continue to farm, because in fact, we farm by adjusting, there's a lot more happening with soil science in
Mhm.
his time than spirit. Well, yeah, so that's one of the places I'm going with it.
Yeah, very interesting that that metaphor allows you to do a lot of different things. That's really
Yeah,
neat. Hmm.
yeah. I mean, also, so some of that grandiosity that I'm grappling with is the exuberance of, the exuberance of abundance, which is intoxicating today. It was also exciting for me. Like I sort of came to this project um, through these really highly wrought writings by Carlo Emilio Gadda um, that are about literature and poetry as much as the industrial processes. So, so I'm interested in that kind of movement.
Hmm. And where those two things bump up against one another.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, what? put Hagley on your radar as an important place to help you do some of this research?
Okay, so I found some really cool things at Hagley. One of them, I mean, there were a few just kind of um, interesting objects that don't have too much directly to do with my project, but one of the things that was really interesting to see was the extent to which um, the business leaders, or some business leaders in the US, were really enamored of Mussolini. And so at Hagley, there's a letter from, I think, Pickard about he had met Mussolini at a talk that he gave. And so he's writing to Mussolini, and it's this very effusive language of like your leadership and all the things you've done for Italy are magnificent. Um, and Mussolini has this dream of developing a fleet of high-speed the Arrow of the Atlantic, a fleet of boats that will reach New York from Naples in 5.5 days. So it's a response to the feasibility of that, but also just generally like singing the praises of Mussolini. So that was interesting to stumble upon. I don't think it's going to have a direct place in my book. So there were two types of documents that will have a direct place in my book, and one is just the kinds of material that were being produced in the US to tell the story of nitrogen. And that includes a radio play called Plowshares, and a story called Nitrogen, Food for Ceres and Martes, or, wheat and war. So there's a lot of effort in the US too to kind of translate this history into an exciting narrative. So that was interesting to see. And then also there's a talk delivered by, I think, Jasper Crane, who was high up in research and development, and he's speaking to a group of engineers in New Jersey. And it's in the late 20s, and he basically says, look, ammonia, the market for ammonia is there's overproduction. We need to think of new uses for ammonia if we want to keep doing this because it really just isn't economically feasible to continue to produce ammonia. So it's interesting to see the sort of frenzy to develop methods to fix atmospheric nitrogen to make ammonia between, let's say, 1918 and 1920, and then how quickly that went overboard. And then it will become, I mean, ammonia is still produced in great quantities today. It didn't really go anywhere, but so that was interesting to see.
Mhm.
The other set of documents at Hagley that are really cool are so in Italy, there were two ammonia processes, and one was developed by this guy, Casale, um, who died young in 1927. And he ended up being a little bit driven out of Italy, and basing his business in Switzerland. And his business was more in licensing the intellectual property than in creating factories. Within Italy, the technology that wasn't necessarily as good, but that was bought up by Montecatini, developed by Giacomo Fauser, that was sort of the basis for most of the ammonia production within Italy. But Casale is this sort of, well, maybe I'm telling this from sort of too deep in it. It's not clear. But anyway, Casale gets driven out of Italy. He's this, I mean, I'm sympathetic to Casale because Carlo Emilio Gadda, this great modernist writer, worked for Casale, as did Franco Rossi, who's this futurist, uh, an unlikely combination of a communist futurist, and he was really good friends with Gadda. So there was this kind of thriving artistic community at Casale, which some people remained in Italy, but the business itself was based in Switzerland. But their process was the most licensed in the world at a certain point, more than the Haber-Bosch process. And DuPont wanted it. And so DuPont did this kind of sneaky thing. So there's a lot of correspondence related to what DuPont did, which is that they They bought the Claude process, which wasn't as good. It was French. And then they started um, a patent infringement case against Casale using a shell company, and that devalued Casale. Then they bought Casale. A complicated but clever um, set of things that actually Tony Travis describes in great detail in a book that I think came out. Well, he sent it to me yesterday. I think it came out. I don't know when it hit the press, but so he has a new book. He's the nitrogen capture guy. Um, I don't know. He's a brilliant scholar who has really written meticulous histories of nitrogen capture and the emergence as a global industry in the interwar period. So he details this situation. What I was interested in the correspondence was the more effective details, like the sense of betrayal that Casale seemed to be speaking about, and the confusion between these sort of interpersonal business practices. Like one of the DuPont businessmen's wife and daughter were going to be in Rome, and they had just missed Casale, things like that. Um, and yeah, so there's some correspondence about that relationship falling apart that was really interesting to see.
Mm.
And I'm not sure how much of that. I don't think that will be like directly in the book, but it helps to shape my thinking about the way that this industry is developing and what it means on a kind of personal and emotional and narrative level.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, those are the main things I found there, and it was a lot of fun. It was a wonderful place to do research.
That's terrific. Now, you mentioned someone in passing, and I know this is outside of the scope of your project itself, but how might this work speak to our current moment?
Oh, well, you know, techno-fascism, techno-futurism. It's funny, a lot of these tech bros call themselves futurists without seeming to really have a sense of the intellectual literary tradition that is evoking. I think they just mean having to do with the future. They don't mean Italian or Russian futurists. But they're the sort of underlying misogyny, the sort of excitement about powerful leaders shares a lot with Italian fascism as well. So that resonates strongly. The pronatalism, the sense in a lot of right-wing movements, there's an insistence upon victimization. The sense that, you hear the current president talking about America is being treated horribly by Europe, and even as we are the most powerful nation and we are supporting, or there's a lot of violence that is issuing from America, but the discourse is one of like the world is treating us unfairly, and that is used to justify a lot of things and also to mobilize people, and it does provide this really powerful kind of imaginary. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
one of the ways, yeah.
yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, Rebecca, it's a fascinating project, and thank you so much for taking the time to share it with us today.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's Hagley.org. Don't be a stranger.